Between the World Cup, Olympics, and presidential elections in 2014, Brazil is set for some big changes. After a decade of breakneck growth, the future for Latin America's largest country is uncertain. Will new policies get growth back on track? And will Brazil play a larger role on the world stage? Building Brazil, next on Great Decisions. Brazil, the world's fifth largest country, has undergone significant change over the past 20 years and is eager to claim a greater role both in the region and the world.
It's a historic, transformative change of a country that was and remains one of the most unequal societies on earth into a democracy that has been able, over the past 20 years or so, to institutionalize the rules of law and integrate more than half of the Brazilian population of 200 million into the middle class.
Brazil increasingly sees itself as a player on the world stage, but I think that the ways in which that needs to be understood are not so much that it wants to be a leader, but rather that it wants to be part of a multipolar world order.
They want functional rule of law that works well. They want a great judiciary. They want great infrastructure. They want growth. They want to be the next big developed country.
In 1964, Brazil's leftist government was toppled by a military coup that had the backing of the CIA.
This was the period that the political scientists referred to as a period of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. It's a kind of authoritarian regime that combined military rule with sectors of big business and sectors of the state bureaucracy.
The military not only decided to stay in power, but at the end of 1968 carried out a series of changes in the Brazilian constitution, basically enacted a new constitution that was much more repressive.
There were obviously very sad episodes during that dictatorship, like a persecution of political opponents, like torture, like deaths, that actually are now in the process of being investigated by a truth commission.
At first, the military government oversaw a period of rapid economic growth, but it was short-lived.
In terms of the economy, the years under the military dictatorship were often called the Brazilian miracle. There were years when Brazil was growing 10+% a year, so Chinese growth rates, and was a time when Brazil really industrialized and came into its own in the world.
As they went through the military dictatorship, the economy deteriorated, and by the time democracy returned to the country, there was a lot of inflation.
Brazil has been fortunate that the capabilities of the state to intervene very actively in the market economy were not dismantled to the same degree that they were in some neighboring countries.
In 1984, protesters took to the streets demanding free elections. In 1985, the military regime relented in part, allowing a civilian to hold the presidency.
There was a gradual period of opening of that political system, culminating in the 1985 transition to civilian leadership.
The coup of '64 that started the dictatorial period was basically a bloodless event, as was the reinstatement of democracy. We have always done this using this innate ability we have as Brazilians to negotiate and to find compromise.
They started having elections for more local level positions. And then finally in 1985, they had an indirect election for president that brought the first civilian president into office after the military dictatorship.
Protesters had won, directly electing their first president and ending 25 years of military rule. Brazil's new era had begun.
It's a society that is democratizing in important ways, not just in the sense of elections and competitive political parties and this sort of thing, but rather in the demands that society puts forth vis-a-vis the political leadership.
Brazil is far from reaching the point where we can declare, let's say, victory. But it is definitely a country going into the right direction, considering what the generation that fought for democracy set up as the national objectives.
With 200 million people, Brazil is among the world's most populous countries.
Today, more than half of the population is classified by the Brazilian Labor Bureau, according to income levels, as part of this middle class.
Now, it's a very generous definition of middle class. Some of the people in the lower rungs of the middle class would be relatively poor by more developed countries' standards.
The coup really set off a demographic process of changing Brazil from a rural agricultural society to an urban industrial society. And now Brazilians are deciding how to move on from that big transition.
Within Brazil's diverse population is a stark socioeconomic divide.
Parts of it seem to be Belgium and parts of it seem to be India. In Brazil, there's been a substantial, tangible improvement, but it's still not at the level that one would expect of an advanced, wealthy economy.
So they've done a wonderful job of lessening income inequality, largely through these cash assistance programs that have brought somewhere between 30 and 40 million Brazilians out of extreme poverty and into what we would consider poverty, but not starvation poverty.
Brazil is one of the few countries on earth where inequality is decreasing. It's still great, but it's still extreme, but it is going in the right direction.
They own their own house, they own their own car, they have appliances, they have cell phones, but they're just hanging on to that bottom of the middle class. But how do you make sure that they're solidly in the middle class, that they're not going to fall back into poverty?
9% of the population lives in poverty, according to the World Bank. 12 million people live in favelas.
Favelas are large communities that exist often on the outskirts of the big cities of Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo. Often they don't have sewage or electricity or the like.
Some of them have, through their hard work and diligence, through some of the public services, including universal health care mandated by the Constitution, and also the public schooling, have been able to leave the favelas and start professional lives and buy homes.
They're converting places where they sold drugs to soccer fields, libraries where kids can be connected. If you deal with the crime and security in the favelas, which clearly Brazil's trying to do, then you begin to see progress.
The poor and the middle class came together to demonstrate against spending public funds on the World Cup and other issues.
These students sometimes don't work, so they have a little bit more time on their hands, and we're able to organize these street protests and really pointed to things of interest to them.
It lasted for a couple of weeks, and then it fizzled at the moment they became violent. Brazilians are not interested in that. They're interested in putting forth a series of demands and hoping that the political class would respond. That did not happen, and that alienated politically, a lot of this middle class.
They felt as if they weren't paying attention to quality of life. That yes, there had been growth, but what are you doing in terms of education? What are you doing in terms of public safety? What are you doing in terms of basic infrastructure? I mean, not, building heliports so that the rich can hop from building to building, but what about the bus systems?
I mean, the big debates in Brazilian cities in the last couple years with the protest has been, how can it be that 25, 30 years into democracy, we still have to commute through bad public transportation to get to work? How is it that 3 decades into democracy, we still don't have good health care?
That fundamental anger with the government's use of its growing wealth has so far not been addressed.
But I think the great challenge for Brazil and for President Rousseff coming out of this election is, what do you need to do to make the economy grow? The country needs to grow, and it needs reform. It needs fiscal reform, it needs tax reform, it needs to get rid of the bureaucracy. There's a lot of state intervention in the economy.
If the economy continues to stagnate or if it goes into decline, I could see it actually being a magnet for even bigger protests.
Much of Brazil's economic growth is tied to globalization, with the nation thriving on its exports of commodities such as sugar, coffee, and iron ore.
It's taken a while for Brazil to liberalize trade, increasing exports and imports. They have to kind of be clever and wise about how to open up to the world and take advantage of it for Brazilians and not at the expense of their wages or purchasing power.
When the demand for commodities came back following the very sharp period of recession in 2008, Brazil was able to recover fairly quickly.
Brazil is blessed with a plethora of natural resources. It is the biggest country in South America, the biggest economy in all of Latin America, 7th largest in the world.
There's a lot of Western firms going down to Brazil feel like they have interlocutors in the private sector that they're much more comfortable with than they would if they went to Russia or if they went to China, without any question, right? Even India, I would say, they feel more comfortable in Brazil.
Brazil's export-based economy is a cause for alarm among many in the international community. The reason? The Amazon rainforest.
The problem with Brazil is there is always this tension between wanting to protect its beautiful environment and the eagerness to develop.
Brazil is one of the biggest producers of all sorts of agricultural products, of beef, of soy, of other types of grains. There's more coming out of Brazil, and so people are moving into lands that are much nearer to, or even including parts of the Amazon, parts of the rainforest.
Environmentalists estimate that 80% of Brazil's deforestation is for grazing land for cattle. As much as 20% of the rainforest is now gone. Industrialization has also made it one of the top 10 emitters of greenhouse gases. That makes Brazil central to the debate on climate change.
One of the real ironies is that, the Amazon is not particularly good for cattle ranching. They'll go in and, sort of clear out large portions of the forest to raise cattle, and then, of course, take them to yet another area after they've exhausted it.
It's facing increasing problems on how to supply the energy it needs. They've been turning more and more to gas-fired and even coal-fired plants. So we're starting to see a country that was really known for its environmental credentials and a very clean energy mix struggle a bit with what its future looks like.
Brazil has pledged to slash emission rates by 36% by 2020. That's more than what some of the world's richest countries, including the U.S., have agreed to. Brazilian officials call the move a political gesture, signaling that on climate change, and perhaps more, the world can follow its lead.
Brazil's government is not a government that needs to convince its opposition that there is such a thing as climate change. Brazil is a country that is open to and eager to join with countries around the world in the resolution of important shared problems.
Already, Brazil is a growing regional and international presence.
One of the roles that Brazil is playing, and that's not sufficiently understood, is as a model for a kind of democratic development with economic growth and greater degrees of equality.
Brazil is now the leading power in Latin America, but I think it also wants to be a friendly power. It feels that it can present itself as a more fraternal rather than paternal leader in the region.
Brazil is the biggest economy there, and it's the big country within South America particularly. It has diplomatic interests in all of its neighbors, but it also has economic interests.
Brazil is a BRICS nation. That's an economic association grouping the world's 5 fastest growing economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Together, they account for 20% of the world's GDP.
Of the BRICS, it's probably the one that would position itself as having the most progressive, for example, labor policies. I think that the BRICS are the kind of cohort of nations that it makes sense for Brazil to associate itself with. These large economies, although Brazil's economy is quite a bit larger than India's and quite a bit smaller than China's.
It's not easy to get those four nations to agree on common strategic interests.
In 2014, they announced the formation of the BRICS Bank, a new multinational development bank. By funding infrastructure development projects and bailing out troubled economies, it may serve as an alternative to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, both of which are dominated by Western nations.
Brazil really gives BRICS the shine that it needs to counter some of the institutions that are established here in Washington, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, who have not been reformed sufficiently to represent the interests of many of the countries in the BRICS.
That's just one of the ways Brazil has realized economic growth yields political might. It's also the largest member of South American trade blocs, like Mercosur.
We have embarked in the 1980s in a strategy built around what we call the Mercosur, supposed to be the common market of South America that would be gradually expanded and then to integrate all countries in this region of South America. Mercosur is now more of a source of problems for Brazil.
I would call it a political bloc. I mean, it's billed as a trade bloc, but if you look at the trading numbers, I don't think you'll find that it's an enormous trade bloc. And it could be an important for trade, but I don't think it is today.
Brazil has a serious problem long term, which is that they have the best house in a lousy neighborhood. And that's never where you want to be. Brazil's by far the best economy of the main Mercosur countries. Brazil is by far the most developed of the BRICS. And if that's the way they continue to orient, then clearly it's going to end up hurting their economy.
Brazil has shown a growing sense of responsibility in regional politics. It's played a leading role in the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Haiti since 2004, to which it has contributed more troops than any other nation.
It has definitely played a very large and constructive role in Haiti over a very, very long time. Just the sheer magnitude of the size of the country, the size of the market, the amount of territory they have, and their desire to be a regional leader, by definition, makes them incredibly important in the region.
That's consistent with Brazil's strong track record in UN peacekeeping around the world.
Brazil prides itself on being non-interventionist, on being non-physical, non-violent in many ways. So it tries to do it, or it says it tries to do it, through persuasion rather than coercion.
The Brazilian perspective is that there should not be countries playing a leadership role. There need to be multilateral cooperation around the various issues of global governance with a very firm commitment to national sovereignty.
Brazil has spent years lobbying for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which still reflects the winning powers from the Second World War. Brazil, like India, Germany, and Japan, argue their status in global affairs means Security Council reform is long overdue.
I think that you need to understand the question of Brazil and the Security Council in the broader context of Brazil's sense, reasonable enough, that the world has changed in recent decades. Brazil is one of several countries that perceives, rightly I think, that the composition of the Security Council is antiquated.
For years, Brazil had a favorable view of the United States, with a 2013 poll revealing that an estimated 3/4 of Brazilians approved of their ally to the north. But those figures have fallen.
The number of flights between Brazil and the United States has multiplied in the past few years. The interest of Brazilians in all things American has increased. Unfortunately, the government, the official relationship, has seen problems due not only to an orientation, an inward-looking orientation of the Brazilian economy, particularly in the recent past, but also as a consequence of revelations of spying by the United States.
It really created tension between Brazil and the United States that was at least unprecedented in the recent past.
I want you to know that we are taking aggressive steps to hold responsible those who stole this information.
Really what it did is it flipped what was emerging as increasing support amongst Brazilians for the Brazilian government to fully engage the Obama administration and come to terms on a number of very difficult issues.
Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff was angered by revelations that the U.S. had spied on Brazilian businesses and politicians, using surveillance techniques made public in the NSA scandal. She canceled a visit to the U.S. and then issued a rebuke against Washington in a speech at the UN General Assembly.
Citizens' personal data and information have been indiscriminately targeted and intercepted.
Dilma Rousseff was a political prisoner of a dictatorship that the Americans supported 50 years ago. And for someone like Rousseff to then have security forces invading her privacy, spying on her and on the Brazilian citizenry more generally is a very, very serious matter.
Chancellor Merkel, President Rousseff were quite angry about the discovery that their own, for example, cell phone communications had been collected and stored and analyzed. There was also a political reaction. It was something that was granular enough that the general public could understand.
President Dilma Rousseff was scheduled to make the first state visit to Washington by a Brazilian president in October of 2013, canceled that visit. There were some major contracts that were about to be announced. One of them, the purchase of $4.5 billion of jet fighters by the Brazilian Air Force from Boeing, and the ongoing contract with Microsoft to provide internet services to the Brazilian government. That was canceled.
You had a real sense of affront from those leaders. I think it makes it harder for the U.S. to get its work done around the world with other countries when people are wondering whether or not we're spying on them.
Relations remained chilly, despite a visit to Brazil by Vice President Joe Biden during the World Cup to warm them.
It did begin to warm relationships. One of the reasons that I think we are destined to have a better relationship is that we're in North America and they in South America are the two largest economic powers.
Vice President Biden went to the World Cup in Brazil, had a meeting with Dilma on June 17th. We were hoping for some breakthrough. And I think that says more about Washington and the Obama administration really not being able to adjust to the stature of Brazil and the legitimate security concerns of its own.
The U.S. relationship with Brazil is about more than trade.
We share this notion, I think, in fundamental values. Number one, democracy. We share a desire for a prosperous hemisphere, a politically stable hemisphere.
Brazil has played a key role in talks with Iran aimed at ensuring Tehran's demands for nuclear technology are limited to civilian use and not for building weapons. The country could also serve as a valuable intermediary for any issues arising between Washington and Cuba, Venezuela, and Russia, where U.S. relations are strained.
As it stands today, the U.S. and Brazil are cordial friends who have a very difficult time deciding on how to go about a strategic alliance together. I think in this sense, Washington's going to have to make a few changes in order to fully incorporate Brazil, one of the most vibrant and largest democracies in the world today, to recruit it onto its game plan.
I think it sees itself as among the nations that are concerned with not just economic development, but also fighting poverty and advancing equality. I think it would like to see itself, whatever the reality of everyday life in Brazil, it would like to see itself as representing a kind of more progressive international politics.
the U.S. and Brazil will likely continue their close relationship. Each nation is too powerful for the other to ignore, but Brazil's engagement with world powers is taking place increasingly on its own terms.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP.